Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. You can see that we're at a remote location again, and once again we're bringing you the show from the lovely city of Nashville, Tennessee. And we want to thank Lipscomb University for being our host, and specifically the Dean Institute for Corporate Governance and Integrity, and thanks to Attorney Stevens for having us and hosting us. So with that, today we're going to talk about our committee chairs providing value and leadership, in addition to some other sort of 30,000-foot questions. And I say that because our guest is a very experienced director. And please welcome Jan Babiak, who's the Audit Committee Chair for Walgreens Boots Alliance, Inc., and also serves on the board of the Bank of Montreal. So Jan, welcome.
Thank you.
So the first question I want to ask you is, I've always been familiar with Walgreens as Walgreens, but now it's Walgreens Boots Alliance, Inc. Could you just quickly explain to our audience why the Boots Alliance, Inc.?
Yes, in December of 2014, we completed an acquisition of a very large global and European healthcare pharmacy organization. And they were big enough that it warranted a name change, and so we moved to being Walgreens Boots Alliance, Inc. And the old WAG indicator is no longer traded in the same way.
Yeah, okay, well, I hope that educated why people will see that that way, because certainly everybody knows Walgreens. Right. So I told you when I invited you that I was going to ask you some challenging questions. So the first one, first of all, between your two boards, you've served as chairman of the audit committee, you served on the risk committee, you've served on the finance committee, so you have a lot of experience. You've served on 5 public boards over your time period. And so my question for you is, why should investors feel more confident about boards today versus 8 years ago when we went through that horrible period of time, that financial crisis, when boards were really targeted as part of the problem? Why should investors feel different today?
Well, I think investors should have more confidence, but it's not just about boards, because you point out that boards were blamed for part of this, but so was society, from the individual consumer who took on too much debt, to the investor who expected too much on a quarterly basis, to the regulators who did or didn't push things where they should have, to the legislatures. I mean, it's a societal issue, and in all of those groups, they've all moved forward and made changes, and the boardroom has made those changes as well. However, I would contend that those changes within the boardroom actually started earlier than that, but it takes a while. You can't, you don't turn on a dime. So if you look back to the beginning of the last decade, when we had all of those major financial business failures, as a result of that,
Enron, WorldCom.
Exactly, exactly, and there were ones internationally as well, Equitable, et cetera. When you start to look at that, you started to see a change from say Sarbanes-Oxley, which has proponents and detractors, and as a result of that, we had some changes to the boardroom that were mandated, including having to have financial experts in the room, and this also had some other changes in that instead of having 10 sitting CEOs, we started putting limitations on how many boards that CEOs could sit on, which really forced diversity in the boardroom, both diversity of thinking, diversity of experience. And so we began changing and evolving, and that change was already underway. So I think, if you take a 15-year look instead of maybe an 8-year look, you will begin to see the evolution and growing up of the boardroom. And, in my prior role, which was within the Big Four as an audit partner and a cybersecurity expert advising boards, I started seeing a change in the last decade of the nature of the questions I was being asked and the sophistication of those questions, as opposed to, you used to feel like you were presenting to people who either hadn't been briefed or hadn't read the papers and were kind of not as engaged. And that changed dramatically late in the last decade and has certainly moved on through this decade.
Yeah, well, I think those of us that have been around the board space certainly can vouch that investors should have more confidence. The level of sophistication, if you will, and process in the boardroom has just improved significantly. Even, like you said, I think the biggest changes have been 15 years ago when those crises happened. And nobody liked Sarbanes-Oxley at the time, and particularly 404, part of that. But if you ask them now, everybody sees that as a real watershed moment for improving boards. So, it's interesting. So I want to get you closer to our topic about board chairs. So I've never done this with anybody, but I'm going to sort of give you a statement, and you need to tell me whether you agree or disagree with this statement or any parts of it.
Okay.
Okay? Will you
right.
mind accepting that challenge?
I'll accept that challenge.
Okay. So over the last 15 years, the majority of the board's work has been migrated to committees. Committees get things done because there are committee chairs who take responsibility, even outside of board meetings, to develop and tackle tough agendas, provide prudent leadership to their committee members. Without board leadership at the whole board level, a board will be naturally less effective.
Okay, you've actually given me three statements.
Right.
All right, so if I take the first one, which is that board work has been migrated to the committees. I'm not sure that I completely agree that that's the case. What I think is it's more, you may remember some decades ago Reagan saying, trust but verify. And I think what has happened in the boardroom is that there is more verification now as opposed to just trust. So when management comes in and presents things, the committee work is actually more about that verification. Which takes me to the second part of the point, which is without committee chairs doing work outside, then we wouldn't be as effective. That I agree with, because as a committee chair, I'll take audit committee chair, it is, I have, between audit committees, I have monthly calls with the CFO, the head of internal audit, and external auditors. I regularly meet with compliance and other groups, depending upon who's presenting. I always meet with the IT and the cyber team, and I also meet with the CEO. And so I have all of those. Now, as much as anything, the committee is not effective unless I have great committee members. So a lot of what I'm doing is actually making sure that they're bringing the right things to the committee in the right way. Because I will find that sometimes management, because they have a managerial perspective, as they should, are not thinking from the mind of a board member in terms of what our governance role is. So a good part of that extra effort is about engaging in getting the right information to the board, as opposed to just, as a board, taking what you're given. And then you have these great people in the room with you. So on a, sitting as an audit committee chair who's a financial expert by the definition defined by the SEC, maybe in one of those pre-meetings, they may call me about a regulatory situation that has come up to warn me or to let me know how much do you want to have in the committee. And I may say, you know what, this other committee member has so much experience in that deep regulatory area. Let me have you talk to them in advance as well. And so it's more about managing and being the Rosetta Stone between the board, the committee, and management.
Well, that's a fascinating answer. Now, I'm not going to let you get off without talking about the whole board.
The whole board, yes, that's the third question.
Yeah.
I have to say that I think you've got to have strong leadership in a boardroom. Now, how that leadership comes, I think you need independent leadership as well. So if I look at my experience in Europe, where we have independent chair, CEO, and a SID, or senior independent director, we have kind of a number of pieces of leadership that bring it together, and I think that makes for the strongest board, kind of not only from the governance and oversight, but also just in terms of giving the investors more comfort with what's going on.
Yeah, my reason for bringing up the point is I often hear a lot in my travels that, well, that's the whole board's responsibility, okay? And whenever I hear that, I think of a committee, and I always worry a committee without leadership really sort of gets nothing done, okay? So I'm okay if somebody says it's the whole board's responsibility, but then prove to me that you've got effective leadership even at the whole board level, because I know people have been very good with their audit chair and their comp chair and even their nom-gov chair, even if they have a risk committee. You know, I like the idea of chairs on those committees because somebody takes responsibility, okay?
Right.
And that's what I worry about when somebody says whole board. So whether that's a lead director, non-executive chair, or it's a person that has emerged as the leader, okay? To me, that's very important, and that's why I asked the question.
Well, it's interesting because when I think about the kind of the whole board responsibility, and sometimes you hear someone say, oh, we can't delegate risk because it's the whole board, or we can't delegate cyber because it's the whole board, or we can't delegate this or that. That goes back to my earlier point about trust but verify, because I think there are times where the whole board needs to vote on and agree on something, but they will look to a committee or a special purpose group or something like that to actually get a lot of the comfort of that verification piece and the looking at the understanding of the details behind it. So just because there's never enough time in the board agenda to spend a lot of time on anything, and if something's really important, there's probably something going on outside that is either led by the lead director or a committee chair or someone who it's delegated to among the board. But I think you've got to make sure that you both spend the time and you take that ownership across the board for certain topics.
We only have a little less than a minute left, so I wanted to make sure I ask you this because this relates to the board chairs as well, and that's how comfortable do you feel about the concept of you addressing major shareholders in a shareholder engagement, sort of representing the audit committee, and then from your experiences, do you think that that's shared by most of your peers as far as that comfort level?
Well, I have a lot of comfort with it because I lived for 20 years, as you know, in the United Kingdom, where it was very common. My first audit committee chair, within the first 6 months, I had met with the 12 largest shareholders, partly at their request, and they wanted to talk to me about my approach and how, you know, my experience base and all of that. Now, I always went with investor relations. I always made sure I knew what we were and weren't saying. I listened to the analyst calls, and so that engagement is very natural. I remember the comp committee chair on that board, she had 18 meetings in the lead up to the vote, and so I think that environment is much more comfortable. So when I came to the U.S., to sit on boards and Canada to a certain extent, I found that many people were less comfortable with that, and that may be the litigious environment which the United States lives within, but I think it can be managed well, and it's appropriate that the people that we represent have a chance to talk to us.
Jan Babiak, I have you on here because you always do a good job and you're very experienced. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We will be back again next week where we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors, Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.